14 days before my wedding, I stood outside my fiancé's office with 2 cups of coffee in my hands, ready to surprise him. The door was open just a crack, and through that crack, I heard the man I was about to marry say 5 words to another woman. "I won the bet, Rachel." I didn't move, I didn't breathe. The coffee in my hands went cold before I did. I wasn't supposed to hear that sentence, but I did. And by the time my wedding day arrived, I would understand that the bet wasn't about love at all. It was about a fortune, a fired housekeeper, and a debt that had been waiting 22 years to be repaid. This is the story of how I almost married a lie, and how the truth found its way to the altar anyway. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to Amazing Folktale, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Hype up the video. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what your local time is in the comments below. I love seeing how these stories connect people from all around the world. Let's get started. My name is Emily Carter, and before any of this happened, I believed in ordinary things. I believed that if you worked hard, showed up on time, and treated people with kindness, life would eventually treat you the same way back. I believed that love, real love, didn't need to hide anything. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town with my mother, Diane, who raised me alone. I never knew much about my father. Diane always said he wasn't meant to stay, and something in her voice told me not to ask twice. She worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood, mornings at a laundromat, evenings cleaning offices downtown. I remember falling asleep on a plastic chair in the corner of some marble lobby while she vacuumed around potted plants that cost more than our rent. I never resented it. If anything, watching my mother work herself thin taught me the one lesson that shaped my entire life. Nothing good comes without effort, and nothing real needs to be dressed up to be worth something. By the time I was 26, I had built a career I was proud of. I worked as an event coordinator for a mid-sized firm in the city. The kind of job where you're invisible until something goes wrong, and then suddenly, you're the only person in the room who matters. I planned corporate galas, milestone birthdays, the occasional wedding. I was good at it because I noticed things other people missed: a centerpiece an inch off center, a groom who looked more nervous than excited, a mother of the bride crying in the coat closet because nobody had asked her how she was doing. I noticed things that would matter later, more than I could have imagined. I met Daniel Wittman on a Tuesday at a corporate open house I had organized for a real estate development group. He wasn't even supposed to be one of the featured guests. He was filling in for a senior partner who canceled last minute. He walked in wearing a suit that fit him a little too well, laughing at something before he'd even reached the door, and I remember thinking, this man has never once doubted that a room will like him. He found me by the dessert table of all places, and asked if the champagne was actually cold or hotel cold, which he explained meant technically chilled, spiritually room temperature. I laughed before I meant to. That was Daniel's gift. He made you laugh before you decided whether you wanted to. We started dating 3 weeks later. He was charming in the way that made you forget to ask questions, successful, attentive, the kind of man who remembered which flowers you casually mentioned liking 6 months earlier. His family, he told me early on, had once been comfortable. His word, though something about the way he said it, made me wonder what comfortable used to look like, and what it looked like now. I fell for him slowly, and then all at once, the way people say happens but that I never believed until it happened to me. By the time he proposed on a rooftop, with string lights and a version of our song played by a violinist he'd hired without telling me, I had stopped asking the questions I should have been asking. I had stopped noticing things. I said yes before he finished the sentence. My mother cried when I told her. Not happy tears, not exactly. Something more complicated than that. I didn't understand it then. I would understand it very soon. If you want to understand this story, you have to understand my mother, Diane Carter, because everything that happened to me had already happened to her. 22 years before I was born, into the middle of it. Diane was not a woman who talked about her past. She kept it folded up small, the way you fold a letter you don't want to read again but can't bring yourself to throw away. What I knew of her life before me came in fragments: a job she once had in a big house, a boss she never named, a period of her life she called simply "before you," as if I had been the line that split her story into 2 parts. She worked constantly. I never once heard her complain about it, not seriously, not in front of me. She had a way of making sacrifice look like nothing at all, folding it into the everyday, skipping her own dinner so I could have seconds, wearing the same winter coat for 11 years, walking 40 minutes home from her second job to save the bus fare for my school supplies. She was, in every way that mattered, the kind of woman this world doesn't reward nearly enough. Kind to strangers who didn't deserve it, loyal to people who never earned it, proud in the quiet way of someone who has been humiliated once and decided never to let it show on her face again. I used to ask her, when I was a teenager, and cruel in the way teenagers are cruel without meaning to be, why she never dated anyone, why she never seemed to want more than the small apartment and the long hours. She would just smile and say, "I had my chance at more once. It didn't work out how I thought." I never pushed. I wish now that I had. When I told her about Daniel, about the proposal, about the rooftop and the string lights, she hugged me tight and said all the right things. But her hands were cold. I remember that specifically, because it was July, and there was no reason for her hands to be cold except for whatever had just walked, uninvited, back into her mind. I didn't know it yet, but my mother's silence over the next several weeks was not disinterest. It was dread. She was watching me walk, smiling and unaware, toward the exact house that had once thrown her away with nothing. Section 4. Introduce villain. Carol Wittman, Daniel's mother, was the kind of woman who complimented you and made you feel smaller in the same sentence. The first time we met, she looked me over not rudely, never rudely, that wasn't her style, and said, "Oh, how lovely. Daniel's always had a soft spot for the practical types." I remember laughing it off because I genuinely didn't understand in the moment that I had just been quietly measured and filed away. Carol had once belonged to a different world than the one she lived in now. You could see it in the way she still spoke, still dressed, still moved through a room like she expected it to part for her, even though the Wittman family fortune, I would later learn, had been quietly bleeding out for years. Their real estate firm, once the pride of 3 generations, had lost major accounts. Their name still opened doors, but the money behind the name had gotten thin. None of that showed on the surface. Carol wore it the way she wore everything perfectly, without a crease. At first, her behavior toward me was nothing you could point to directly. A comment about my budget-friendly dress at a family dinner. A joke about how refreshing it was that Daniel had found someone so grounded. Said in a tone that made grounded sound like a polite word for beneath us. She would ask about my mother's job with a curiosity that felt less like interest and more like she was double-checking something she already suspected. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself mothers are always a little difficult with their son's new fiancé. I wanted so badly to believe that the discomfort I felt around her was mine to fix, not hers to explain. Looking back, I understand now that Carol Wittman was never simply cold to me. She was calculating. Every warm smile, every compliment about my work ethic, every small kindness she extended was a brick in a wall she had been building long before I ever walked through her front door. I just didn't know yet what the wall was protecting or who it had been built to keep out. Section 5. Early conflict. 14 days before the wedding, I decided to surprise Daniel at his office with coffee, the way I sometimes did on slow afternoons. I took the elevator up, signed in at the front desk, and walked toward his corner office, already smiling at the thought of his face lighting up. The door was open a few inches. I heard voices before I saw anyone. Daniel's, low and familiar, and a woman's, unfamiliar and hushed. "I won the bet, Rachel," Daniel said. I stopped walking. Something about his tone wasn't playful. It was relieved. Almost tired, the way you sound when a long weight finally lifts off your chest. I peered through the gap in the door. Daniel was leaning against his desk, arms crossed. Across from him stood a woman I didn't recognize. Dark hair, a blazer that looked expensive in an understated way, and an expression that had nothing to do with laughter. She looked like she was about to cry. That confused me more than anything else. If you win a bet, people laugh, they tease. This woman looked like someone had just told her a person had died. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I don't think you understand what you're." The door creaked. I stepped back too fast, nearly spilling the coffee, and by the time Daniel looked up, I was already retreating toward the elevator, my heart slamming against my ribs. He caught up to me in the lobby. "Hey, I didn't know you were coming by," he said, kissing my cheek like nothing in the world was wrong. "You okay? You look pale." "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired." I didn't tell him what I'd heard. I don't fully know why, even now. Maybe some instinct told me that if I asked the question out loud, I would only get a lie in return, and I wasn't ready yet to know the shape of that lie. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened our text thread. 40 minutes before I'd overheard that conversation, Daniel had texted me, "Can't wait to marry you. Only 14 days left." I stared at the message for a long time. Which version of him was real, the man typing hearts into his phone, or the man in that office saying he'd won something? I told myself it was nothing, a joke between old friends, a private nickname for some meaningless competition, maybe about who'd close a deal first, who'd get married first, who knows. But that night, I did something I'd never done before in 3 years with Daniel. I opened his desk drawer, the one he kept locked, that I'd never had a reason to open because I'd never had a reason to doubt him. It wasn't locked that night. Inside, tucked beneath old receipts, was a photograph. Daniel, younger, maybe 5 years younger, in a suit, standing beside the same woman from the office, Rachel, at what was unmistakably a wedding. Not ours. Someone else's, or perhaps theirs. I sat on the edge of our bed with that photograph in my hands for what felt like an hour, turning it over as if the back might explain the front. There was nothing written on it. No date, no name, nothing but a faint crease down the middle, like it had been folded once and then carefully smoothed flat again, kept, not discarded. You don't keep a photograph you don't care about. You especially don't keep it in a locked drawer. I thought about all the small moments over the past 3 years, that I had never questioned the way Daniel sometimes went quiet when certain wedding venues came up. The way he'd once steered us away from a restaurant downtown without explaining why, saying only that the food wasn't as good as people say. I had filed those moments away as nothing, the ordinary static of dating someone with a past. Now I wondered how many of them had actually been him quietly avoiding a version of his own history he didn't want me to see. I put the photo back exactly where I found it, and I didn't sleep at all. 2 days later, I brought Rachel's name up at dinner with my mother, as casually as I could manage. "Do you know a woman named Rachel? Dark hair, works in real estate circles, friend of Daniel's." I watched my mother's face change in real time. The color left it slow and total, like watching a light dim on a rheostat. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "Why do you ask?" she said, too carefully. "No reason, just met her at his office." I studied her. "Mom, do you know her?" "No," she said too fast, and then she stood up to clear plates that weren't empty yet. I didn't push. But I noted it, the way I noted the centerpiece an inch off center, the way I noted things other people missed. My mother knew something, or suspected something, and she wasn't going to tell me on her own. That was the night I decided I wasn't going to confront Daniel yet. Confrontation, I'd learned in years of managing difficult events, tips your hand too early. It lets the other person control the story. What I needed instead was information. I needed to understand the shape of what I was dealing with before I said a single word about it. So I started watching. Quietly, carefully, the way you watch a room when you sense something is about to go wrong, but you don't yet know what. 3 days after that, I found a shared digital calendar Daniel and I used for wedding planning, and out of habit, I scrolled back further than I meant to 8 months earlier. Before we'd even met. There was a single event, still visible in his archived entries, titled only "Deadline." No further description, no location, just that one word sitting alone in a random Tuesday 8 months before Daniel and I had our first conversation over hotel cold champagne. I didn't know what it meant. But something about a single word deadline sitting quietly in his calendar months before we even met made my stomach turn in a way I couldn't explain. Then Carol called. She had never once called me directly in the entire time Daniel and I had dated, but that afternoon my phone lit up with her name, and when I answered, her voice came through syrupy warm in a way that immediately felt wrong. "Sweetheart," she said, a word she had never used for me, not once, in 3 years. "I just wanted to say how thrilled I am for the wedding. Truly, you've made my son so happy." It should have felt nice. Instead, it felt rehearsed, like a line she'd practiced in a mirror. I thanked her and hung up, and sat with the phone in my lap for a long time, trying to understand why a compliment had made the hair on my arms stand up. Later that week, doing what I told myself was just idle curiosity, I looked up the Wittman family's real estate firm in public business filings. What I found didn't match the image Daniel had always presented: successful, thriving, stable. The firm had quietly lost a major client 3 months earlier. Revenue was down. There were liens I didn't fully understand the legal weight of, but understood enough to know they weren't good. Money. Somewhere in all of this, money was involved, in ways nobody had told me about. That night my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "We need to talk, not about what you think, Rachel." I read it 4 times. What did she think I thought? The obvious assumption sat in my chest like a stone that Rachel was the other woman, that the bet was some cruel game about seducing a taken man, that Daniel was somehow still tangled up with her behind my back. It was the simplest explanation, the one that would have made this whole ordeal almost easy, in a strange way. A cheating fiancé is a story everyone already knows how to tell. You cry, you leave, you rebuild. But her text specifically told me not to assume that. Not about what you think, which meant whatever this actually was, it was going to be something I hadn't imagined yet, and some instinct, the same one that had kept me quiet in his office doorway, told me it was going to be worse. I set my phone face down on the counter and didn't answer it that night. I needed to decide first whether I was ready to know. I didn't respond to Rachel right away. I sat on my bed staring at that message until the screen dimmed and went dark on its own. Instead, I called my best friend Jess, the one person I trusted enough to say out loud what I hadn't said to anyone else. "Something's wrong," I told her. "I don't know what, but something is very wrong, and I need you to find out who this woman actually is to Daniel." Jess didn't ask many questions. She had a talent, half professional and half nosy friend instinct, for finding things out. 2 days later she called me back, and I could hear in her voice that she wasn't going to make this easy to hear. "Emily," she said, "they were engaged, Rachel and Daniel, 3 years ago. It never made it to the wedding, called off with barely any explanation from what I can find. No public announcement, nothing dramatic, it just stopped." I sat down hard on my kitchen floor, phone pressed to my ear, staring at nothing. "There's something else," Jess said quietly. "The engagement ended almost exactly a week before you met him." A week. 7 days between a broken engagement and a chance encounter at an open house that I had always believed was fate. I didn't sleep that night either. I lay awake running the timeline over and over: the deadline on the calendar, the broken engagement, the week-long gap, the bet Daniel claimed to have won. None of it made sense as separate pieces, but something about the way they were lining up made me feel, for the first time, that I was not looking at coincidence. I was looking at a pattern someone had built on purpose, and I had walked directly into the middle of it, smiling the whole way. 7 days before the wedding, I finally agreed to meet Rachel. We met at a small coffee shop far from anywhere either of us usually went, both of us choosing the location, I think, because neither of us wanted to be recognized. She looked nervous in a way that surprised me, not guilty like a woman caught doing something wrong, but scared, like someone finally about to say something she'd held in for a long time. Her first sentence undid every assumption I'd built. "The bet wasn't about you," she said. "It was never about you." I stared at her. "Then who was it about?" She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup like she needed something to hold on to. "It goes back further than you think, further than me even." "Then tell me," I said. "Please, I'm done not knowing." She took a breath. "The bet was made years ago, between Daniel and his father before his father died. It wasn't a joke between friends, it was a promise, the kind of promise a father makes his son when he's trying to control him even from the grave." "What kind of promise turns into someone saying I won?" I asked, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. Rachel looked down at the table. "I was supposed to be the one he married. To fulfill it, I backed out." "Why?" I asked. "Why would you walk away from marrying into a family like that?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You need to ask Carol, not Daniel. He doesn't know everything. I don't think he ever did." "Why not Daniel?" I asked, my chest tightening. Rachel just shook her head, like the answer wasn't hers to give. "There's a difference," she said carefully, "between what Daniel did and what was done to Daniel. I think you're about to find out which one this actually is. But it's not my story to hand you. It never was. I only backed out of my part in it. I don't get to write the ending for you." I wanted to press her further, but something in her face told me she meant it, that this wasn't her protecting anyone, it was her respecting a boundary she had clearly crossed once before and regretted. She reached into her bag and slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "Not the answer," she said, "just an address. This is where Carol volunteers on Thursday mornings, a charity gala committee. If you want to ask her yourself, that's where you'll find her with her guard down the most." I took the paper without a word and left the coffee shop feeling like I was holding a map to a place I wasn't sure I wanted to arrive at. I went home that night with more questions than I'd started with, and a strange, restless pull toward my mother's old things boxes I hadn't opened in years, stacked in the back of her closet. I don't know exactly why I went looking. Call it instinct. Call it the same skill that let me spot a crooked centerpiece from across a ballroom. Something told me the answer wasn't only in Daniel's family, it was in mine too. In the third box, beneath old photographs and a stack of expired coupons my mother could never bring herself to throw away, I found a folded letter, yellowed at the edges, addressed in careful handwriting to a name I didn't expect to see in my mother's things at all. Carol Wittman. My hands went cold, the same way my mother's had the day I told her about the engagement. I was still holding the letter when my mother walked into the room. She stopped in the doorway. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I watched her eyes move from my face to the paper in my hand, and something in her expression collapsed, not anger, not even surprise, but a kind of exhausted relief, like she'd been waiting years for this exact moment to arrive and dreading it in equal measure. "Mom," I said quietly, "why do you have a letter with Carol Whitman's name on it?" Her hands were shaking. I had never, not once in 26 years, seen my mother's hands shake. "Sit down, Emily," she said. "It's time I told you something." I sat. She sat across from me, folding and unfolding her own hands like she needed somewhere to put the nervous energy. 22 years ago," she said, "I worked as a housekeeper for a family named Wittman." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "Carol's family," I said. It wasn't a question. My mother nodded. "I worked there almost 3 years. I was young. It was good money, good enough that I thought for a while that things might finally be looking up for me." She paused, and I watched her gather the strength to keep going. "Then I got pregnant. With you. And they fired you," I said, the pieces already assembling themselves in my mind faster than I wanted them to. "The week they found out," my mother said. "No severance, no explanation beyond 'we no longer require your services.' I was 3 months along, no savings, no family to fall back on. I had to start completely over alone carrying you." I felt the floor of my understanding shift beneath me. Every sacrifice I had watched my mother make, the 2 jobs, the 11-year-old coat, the meals she skipped, all of it traced back to a decision made by the family I was about to marry into. "Does Daniel know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Does he know who I am to that family?" My mother didn't answer. She just looked away, toward the window. The way she used to look away from questions about my father when I was a teenager who didn't know better than to keep asking. Her silence told me more than words could have. I confronted Daniel that same night. Not about the bet. Not yet. I asked him, directly, whether he knew that my mother had once worked for his family, whether he knew she'd been fired the week she discovered she was pregnant with me. His face did something I hadn't expected. He went completely still, the color draining from him the same way it had drained from my mother days earlier. "Emily, I swear to you I had no idea," he said. "I didn't know. I promise you I didn't know." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly that I almost let myself. But I had spent years learning to notice the details other people missed, and something about the timing of everything, the deadline, the bet, the broken engagement exactly a week before we met, refused to let me simply accept his shock at face value. "I need to see something," I told him. "I need you to open your email, the old archived folder, the one you never check." He looked confused, but something in my voice must have told him not to argue. He handed me his laptop. It took less than 10 minutes to find it. An email from Carol, sent the exact week Daniel and I met. "She's the housekeeper's daughter," it read. "This is perfect. Don't let her find out." I read it twice, my hands trembling now the way my mother's had trembled days before. Daniel read it over my shoulder, and I watched something break behind his eyes, not performance, not the practiced charm I'd fallen in love with, but something that looked, for the first time since I'd known him, like genuine horror. The next line of the email was worse. "You'll win the inheritance either way, just marry someone who won't ask where the money came from." There it was, the bet. Not a joke between old friends. A cold, calculated wager his own mother had engineered using me, using my mother's 22-year-old wound, as the quiet instrument to secure a fortune. I stood up from the couch, my whole body cold. "Did you know about this?" I asked him. "Any of it?" "No," he said, and his voice cracked in a way I had never heard before. "Emily, I swear on everything. I never read this email. I don't check that folder. I didn't know." I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. Instead, I felt something colder settle over me, the same steady, watchful calm I used when a wedding was falling apart in real time and someone needed to be the one person in the room who didn't lose their head. I was going to find out exactly how deep this went. And then I was going to decide, on my own terms, what I wanted to do about it. 3 days before the wedding, I learned the rest of it, piece by piece. The way you pull a splinter out slowly because pulling it fast would hurt more than you can stand. Jess helped me dig through the public records of Daniel's father's estate. What we found explained everything the email had only hinted at. Daniel's late father's will contained a clause, an old-fashioned, almost cruel condition requiring Daniel to be legally married by a set date in order to unlock control of the family estate. Miss the deadline, and the estate would pass instead to a distant cousin the family barely spoke to. That deadline explained the strange calendar entry from 8 months before Daniel and I ever met, the single word, deadline, sitting alone in his calendar like a countdown nobody else could see. And the estate itself, I learned with a sick twist in my stomach, was the very same property, the very same family fortune, that had pushed my mother out the door 22 years earlier, with nothing but a box of her belongings and a baby on the way. Jess pulled up the county filings on her laptop and turned the screen toward me. There it was, in the dry, clinical language of legal documents, the late Mr. Wittman's will, drafted 9 years before his death, stipulating that his son shall be lawfully married no later than the 5th anniversary of this instrument's filing, or control of the estate shall pass in full to the surviving next of kin. Beneath it, a second clause, added in an amendment 2 years later, listed the surviving next of kin by name. A cousin named Preston Wittman, someone Daniel had mentioned to me exactly once, in passing, calling him the guy at Thanksgiving nobody really talks to. I sat back in my chair, the pieces finally locking into a shape I could see whole. Carol hadn't simply wanted her son happily married. She had needed him married by a specific date, to a specific kind of woman, someone unconnected enough to the family's world to never think to check where the money had come from, or what it had cost to keep it. I thought about the timeline again, laid out now with brutal clarity. Rachel's engagement ending, the single word in the calendar. The open house Daniel wasn't even supposed to attend. None of it had been fate. It had been engineering, dressed up so carefully that even the groom hadn't recognized his own wedding as a transaction. I went back to Rachel, because she was the only person in this entire story who seemed to have chosen honesty over convenience, even when it cost her something. I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest for days. Why did you really back out of marrying into that family? Was it the money? The pressure? Rachel was quiet for a moment, staring into her coffee like it held the words she needed. "Because I found out what happened to a woman named Diane," she finally said. "I found out Carol had fired a pregnant housekeeper and left her with nothing. and I found out the family had been sitting on that story like it never happened. I couldn't do it, Emily. I couldn't marry into that and pretend it didn't matter. I sat back in my chair, something loosening in my chest that I hadn't realized was clenched. The other woman I had feared, the woman whose name had haunted me for over a week, turned out to be the one person who had refused, at real personal cost, to be part of the lie. That same evening, Carol showed up at my apartment, unannounced, holding a small gift bag of wedding favors, smiling like nothing in the world was wrong. She had no idea, yet, how much I already knew. "I just wanted to drop these off myself," she said, breezing past me into the living room like she owned it. "Personalized touches matter so much, don't you think?" I watched her set the bag down, arranging it just slightly, the way she arranged everything to look effortless. And I decided, in that moment, to test her. "Carol," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, "did you fire a housekeeper named Diane 22 years ago?" "Oh." Her smile didn't waver, not even slightly. "I don't remember every person who worked for us, dear," she said, adjusting the ribbon on the gift bag, as if I'd asked her something as trivial as the weather. The coldness in that answer, the ease with which she erased my mother's suffering into a shrug, told me everything I needed to know about the woman I had been about to call my mother-in-law. I almost let her walk out the door without saying another word. But something in me, maybe the part of me that had spent years noticing what other people overlooked, refused to let the moment close that easily. "Carol," I said, "I found the email, the one you sent Daniel the week we met." For the first time since I'd known her, Carol Wittman went completely silent. The gift bag stayed exactly where she'd set it, ribbon perfectly straight, and for a moment neither of us moved. "I don't know what you think you found," she finally said, her voice quieter now, less rehearsed. "I think I found the truth," I said, "and I think you've spent 22 years hoping nobody would ever ask you to say it out loud." She didn't answer that. She picked up her purse, and for just a second before she turned to leave, I saw something cross her face that looked almost like fear, the fear of a woman who has spent her whole life being untouchable, realizing for the first time that the walls she built might not hold. "The wedding is still happening," she said stiffly at the door. "I do hope you'll think carefully before you do anything foolish with information you don't fully understand." "I understand it perfectly," I said. "I think that's exactly the problem for you." She left without another word. I stood in my living room a long time after the door clicked shut, shaking, but steadier than I expected to feel. That night, Daniel found me crying on the bathroom floor of my own apartment, the door not even locked, because some part of me had wanted him to find me exactly like that. He didn't yell, he didn't demand answers or defend himself before I'd even accused him of anything. He sat down on the floor beside me, careful, like he was afraid one wrong move would send me further away from him, and he simply asked, "Please, just tell me the truth, all of it." So I did. I told him about the email, the calendar entry, the deadline, the inheritance clause, Rachel's confession, and finally, the conversation with Carol just hours earlier, her flat, practiced denial of my mother's entire existence. Daniel listened without interrupting, his face growing paler with every sentence, until by the end he looked like a man standing in the wreckage of a house he thought he'd built, only to discover the foundation had been laid by someone else entirely, without his knowledge or consent. "I want you to know something," he said finally, his voice rough. "I loved you before any of this. I fell for you at that stupid open house because you laughed at a joke about hotel cold champagne, not because my mother orchestrated some kind of test. I need you to believe that." "I want to believe you," I said honestly, "but I don't know anymore what's real and what was arranged for me." He nodded slowly, like he understood he had no right to demand my trust back, only to try to earn it. The next morning, Daniel did something I hadn't expected. He confronted his mother directly, without me there, without warning her first. He told me about it afterward, his hands still shaking from the conversation. Carol had not denied it, not to her own son, the way she had denied it to me. She admitted the marriage had been engineered from the start, the timing, the introduction, even the coincidence of Rachel's broken engagement clearing the path exactly when it did. But she framed it, to Daniel, not as cruelty. "I did it because I love you," she told him. The estate was slipping away. "I did what a mother does to protect her son's future." Motive had shifted, in that single conversation. From something that looked like simple cruelty into something more complicated, a desperation dressed up as love. The kind of justification people use when they've convinced themselves that the ends excuse whatever they had to do to reach them. It didn't excuse what she'd done, not to my mother, not to me. But it explained at least why a woman could look me in the eye and lie without her smile ever cracking. She had told herself, for 22 years, that erasing my mother from the story was simply the cost of protecting her son. The night before the wedding, Daniel came to my apartment one final time. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "I want to go through with it," he said. "Not for the money. I already told my mother I'm walking away from the inheritance clause entirely, whether you say yes tomorrow or not. I want to marry you because I love you, Emily. Not because of a bet my father made before I was even old enough to understand what a promise like that costs a person." Part of me wanted to believe him completely, right there, without hesitation. But another part of me, the part that had spent the last 2 weeks learning just how far people in his family were willing to go to protect an image, needed more than words. "How do I know this isn't just one more performance?" I asked him quietly. "One more thing you're saying because it's what the moment requires." He didn't get defensive. He just looked at me, exhausted and honest in a way I hadn't seen from him before. "You don't," he admitted. "You just have to decide if you trust who I've been to you, underneath all of this." I went to see Rachel one last time that same night, needing to hear it from someone who had already walked away from this exact family once before, someone who had nothing left to gain by protecting Daniel's image. If he really loved me, I asked her, would he have found out sooner? Wouldn't he have noticed something was wrong? Rachel considered the question carefully before answering, and her response surprised me with its generosity. "Carol is very good at hiding things, Emily. Better than almost anyone I've ever known. I was engaged to this family for a year, and I didn't find out the full truth until after I'd already left. Daniel not knowing doesn't mean Daniel didn't care. Sometimes the people closest to the lie are the last ones let in on it." I sat with that for a long time after I left her. Later, I asked my mother the question I probably should have asked from the very beginning. "What do you actually want out of this, Mom? Not revenge, not money, what do you want?" She thought about it longer than I expected, and when she finally answered, her voice was steady in a way I hadn't heard in weeks. "I want an apology," she said. Spoken out loud, in front of people who once looked at me like I was furniture to be moved out of the way. That's all I ever wanted, Emily, just to be seen, once, by the people who made me feel invisible. That night, I made my decision about the wedding. I told no one, not Daniel, not my mother, not even Jess. I needed, for the first time in this entire ordeal, a decision that belonged only to me. The morning of the wedding, I arrived at the venue early, my dress still in its garment bag, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. Carol was already there, dressed, radiant, directing the florist like nothing had happened, like the last 2 weeks had simply never occurred. I watched her for a moment before she noticed me, thinking about how easily some people carry the weight of what they've done, how practiced they've become at setting it down whenever it's inconvenient to hold. Before the ceremony began, I asked the officiant for the microphone. Guests shifted in their seats, exchanging glances, the way people do when they sense something unscripted is about to happen. I felt Daniel's eyes on me from the front of the room. Uncertain, bracing. His hands were clasped in front of him, knuckles pale, and I could see him searching my face for some sign of what was coming, the same way I had once searched his for signs of a lie. I thought, standing there in a dress I had chosen months earlier for a wedding I thought I understood, about every version of this morning I had imagined over the past 2 weeks. I had imagined walking out entirely, leaving the venue in silence, letting Carol explain the empty altar to her guests herself. I had imagined confronting her publicly, listing every cruelty in order, watching her polished composure shatter in front of the people whose opinions she valued more than her own conscience. I had imagined, more than once, simply saying nothing at all, swallowing the whole ugly truth, and marrying Daniel anyway. Telling myself it was enough that we knew, privately, and didn't need an audience. None of those endings had felt right when I actually pictured living inside them. This one did. "I'm not calling off the wedding," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "But before we begin, there's something important I need to say first." I didn't expose Daniel. I didn't stand up there and list every betrayal, every manipulation, every calculated lie that had brought us to this room. That wasn't the story that needed telling that day. Instead, I called my mother to the front. Diane walked up slowly, visibly shaking, glancing at me like she wasn't sure this was really happening. I took her hand and turned to face the room. Carol's smile finally beginning to falter in the third row. 22 years ago, I said, my mother worked in this family's home. She was fired the week she found out she was pregnant with me. No severance, no explanation, just told she was no longer needed. The room had gone completely silent. She has spent every day since then rebuilding a life that was taken from her without a second thought. I found out only weeks ago that the man I'm marrying today comes from that very same family. And I think, before anything else happens today, my mother deserves to finally say what she never got the chance to say. I handed her the microphone. Diane's voice shook at first, but it grew steadier with every sentence. 22 years of silence finally finding the room it had always deserved. She told the guests, told Carol directly, exactly what had happened to her: the firing, the fear, the years of struggle that followed a decision made carelessly by someone who had never once had to face the consequences of it. Carol sat frozen, cornered publicly for what I suspect was the very first time in her life. There was no smooth deflection this time, no rehearsed warmth to hide behind. Every eye in the room was on her, waiting. Finally, her voice barely audible, Carol stood and said the words my mother had waited 22 years to hear. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was wrong. What I did to you was wrong, and I'm sorry." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real, spoken out loud, in front of the exact people who had once made my mother feel invisible, and that, my mother had told me, was all she'd ever truly wanted. The wedding still happened that day, but not before Daniel walked to the front of the room and made an announcement of his own. He publicly signed away his claim to the inheritance clause his father had written, choosing me without a single dollar attached to the decision. He said it plainly, without performance this time. "I don't want a marriage that was engineered. I want the one I actually chose." Carol quietly lost in the weeks that followed the social standing she had spent decades protecting at any cost. Word travels in the circles she moved through, and an apology forced into the open has a way of following a person longer than any of the compliments she used to hand out so easily. She and Daniel began, slowly, the long work of rebuilding something honest between them, not the relationship they'd had before, but something new, built without secrets this time. Rachel, the woman I had once feared, became, in the end, the unlikely reason any of this truth ever surfaced at all. She and I stayed close after that day, an unexpected friendship built out of the wreckage of a story neither of us had asked to be part of. She told me once, months later, over coffee at that same small shop where she'd first said, "The bet wasn't about you," that walking away from the Wittman fortune 3 years earlier had been the loneliest decision of her life. Her own family hadn't understood it. Some friends had called her foolish for giving up that kind of security. But watching my mother stand at the front of that ballroom, finally heard after 22 years, she said it was the first time she'd felt certain she'd made the right choice. Diane never went back to housekeeping work. Within a year, using a small settlement Carol quietly and privately arranged, not asked for, not demanded, simply offered, the closest thing to restitution she knew how to give. My mother opened a small flower shop 2 blocks from our old apartment. She named it after nothing in particular, just a plain, practical name, because she said she'd spent enough of her life being told what things should be called by people who never bothered to ask her opinion. I stop by most Sundays. She still works too hard. Some habits don't undo themselves overnight, but her hands don't shake anymore, not when Carol's name comes up, not when she tells the story now to anyone who asks. My mother stood beside me for the rest of that ceremony, her hand steady in mine. 22 years of silence finally put down. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need money. She had only ever needed to be seen, and on the one day she least expected it, she finally was. I think about that overheard sentence. Often I won the bet, and how close I came to marrying a man without ever understanding what those 5 words truly meant. I think about how easy it would have been to let the moment pass, to convince myself I'd misheard, to walk down the aisle without asking a single hard question. But I had spent my whole life noticing the details other people missed. And in the end, that habit didn't just save my wedding, it gave my mother back a piece of herself that had been taken from her before I was even born. Some debts take 22 years to come due, but when they finally do, spoken out loud in a room full of people who once looked away, they are paid in full. Exactly once. And exactly enough.
Moral of the story: truth has a way of surfacing exactly when it's needed most, but only if someone is brave enough to keep asking questions instead of settling for comfortable silence. Emily could have ignored the overheard sentence, dismissed her mother's shaking hands, and walked down the aisle without ever knowing the cost her happiness was built on. Instead, she chose to look closer, even when looking closer terrified her. This story teaches us that love without honesty is just a well decorated lie, and that generational wounds don't heal on their own. They need to be spoken aloud, in front of the people who caused them, before they can truly close. Carol's cruelty came from fear disguised as love, proving that protecting someone by deceiving them always eventually costs more than the truth would have. And Diane's quiet dignity reminds us that patience and grace are never weakness, they are simply strength waiting for its moment. In the end, real justice wasn't revenge. It was one honest apology, 22 years overdue, finally spoken out loud.